Hello, and welcome to a Skyrim thing. I made a video a bit ago that was about the enduring popularity of the Skyrim Stealth Archer meme. If you're here, there's a good chance it's because of that video. Welcome, by the way, it's good to see you again. I spoke about the mage playstyle at something resembling length during that video, but I didn't give as much screen time to melee. So today, I'm going to make up some of that debt by talking about a game design issue unique to melee in Skyrim. But before we get right into it, I want to give a quick shout out to my members, currently on screen. These folks go above and beyond to support the channel, and I'm very grateful to them. Being a member is never required, but always appreciated. Thank you. One final thing to preload the video with, mods. They're on screen and linked in the description. They're all quality of life kind of stuff, and they don't modify the gameplay mechanics because this is a discussion and analysis of the vanilla game as designed. And that's it. Short and sweet new format for the mod disclaimer. Moving on. In that Stealth Archer video from a bit ago, I really did not talk about melee that much. A full quarter of the video was actually about the mage playstyle, but only half as much was said specifically about melee. 26 versus 13% of the script by word count, if you're a curious nerd like me. That wasn't malicious or even intentional. I genuinely just don't find the melee system interesting enough to warrant particularly deep analysis. Hit thing with stick until thing die isn't that complicated at the end of the day, and Skyrim does... it does well enough for the kind of game that Skyrim is. An approachable, mass appeal action RPG that's pretty light on the RPG, and doesn't do anything too challenging with its fantasy setting. Unless you really go looking for it. The average Skyrim player does not know anything about the towers, for example. And just to be clear, I am aware of deep and interesting first-person melee systems that exist in other games. Chivalry, Mordhau, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, list continues. But ask yourself if your favorite one would honestly fit in the kind of game that Skyrim is. And now, ask yourself if you would trust Bethesda with the task of somehow building that into their creaking abomination of an engine. The answer to one or both of those questions is no, and if you claim otherwise, I don't believe you, but I'll still read your comment about it. And speaking of comments, and I swear I'm going somewhere with this, I see every top level comment, and when I've praised the comment section at the end of some of these videos, I really do mean it. There's always some good discussions going on down there. But one recurring comment that kept showing up on the Stealth Archer video was something I actually neglected to mention in that video entirely. Dragons! Kind of the whole point of the game, or so the marketing might lead you to believe. I didn't mention dragons because I find the gameplay mostly lives elsewhere, but marketing gonna market. In any case, the recurring comment brought up that melee was effectively disincentivized by way of, dragons can fly, and they're kinda hard to hit with a pointy stick when they're up there. Obviously, your melee character has to dip into their limited pools of magic or archery to fill the gap in their arsenal that is range. Historical knights were still skilled with a bow, and we still train today's troops, in some comparatively limited capacity, in melee combat. That's how it works. However, unlike with magic and ranged, the solution to the dragon problem for melee characters isn't as simple as buying a new spell or having enough arrows, because it's Dragonrend, part of an entirely different mechanic. But Dragonrend has its own problems as a solution for melee characters dealing with dragons. An argument I see quite often in gaming discussions is X fixes whatever. Sometimes, and especially often with Skyrim, X is a mod, and that's a whole other topic, but it can also be something in-game, and when it is, it's often in the form of lock and key design. Lock and key design is used in basically every game. It's an easily understood bit of game design that can be abstracted out into a wide range of scenarios. Essentially, the game presents a problem to be solved, that's the lock, and a solution to that specific problem, the key. Sometimes it's literally a key that you use to open a locked door, but it can also be unlocking a movement mechanic to access new areas in a Metroidvania, raid mechanics in MMOs, and damage type weaknesses and resistances can even be seen through this lens. Sometimes, the presentation of a lock and its key gets some pomp and circumstance, with the lock being presented as a difficult challenge that must be, essentially, solved by brute force before the matching key is presented. Not an impossible task, just one that requires a suboptimal solution. Here's a hypothetical example. A game, doesn't matter what genre, has a whole set-piece boss fight where beating them is not entirely straightforward. You know, standard tricking the boss into charging a pillar to stun them kind of boss mechanics stuff. After beating the boss, you get a weapon that counters that guy's armor, and then that's just, like, a tanky enemy type going forward. Maybe the normal ones are smaller and take 2 hits instead of several, but we're gamers here, we know how this works, because this pattern happens throughout all of gaming. It's commonplace throughout the industry because it's good and effective game design. You give the player a challenge to overcome, then allow them to demonstrate mastery of the task. It's also a bit of a psychological hack. The experience is initially frustrating, but plowing through later iterations feels very cathartically satisfying. It's a powerful feeling. Lock and key design works great, but it's not without potential pitfalls, and open world games are especially prone to running into those issues like a skooma head on a bender. In traditionally linear games, developers have near total control over the pacing of presenting the player with both the lock and the key. Thinking back to the hypothetical boss turned tanky enemy type, the key is given in the room right after the lock is first shown. In other cases, a first-person shooter might give the player a new gun, and through years of gaming experience, a little voice in our mind rightly says, "This is a key, and I'm about to run through a gauntlet of locks with it." But in open-world games, the developers surrender a significant portion of their control over pacing to us, the players. That's a design consideration that needs to be taken into account for every decision across the entire game. Game design is a genuinely difficult and imprecise science that deals almost exclusively in moving parts and unpredictable variables. And by unpredictable variables, I mean the player, who could be a 6-year-old hopped up on red pixie sticks, or a dad pushing 40 and trying to sneak in half an hour while the melatonin kicks in, and everything in between. In the case of open world, or more specifically non-linear games, the in-game, non-mod solution to whatever problem ultimately comes down to either your build or your progress. And I'm going to go over both of those. In any RPG worth its salt, and Skyrim is certainly worth at least that, there will be a number of archetypes the player can play as. And these roles are both enhanced and enforced by player choices within one or more systems that result in what is called a build. This is your skill point allocation and gear in Skyrim, the stat points, gear, and abilities you have on your Atlas character, the weapons and perks you pick on your Call of Duty loadout. Call of Duty still has perks, right? I haven't played one of those since Ghosts, I think? No, I have one from about 2017 when I built my computer. You know, back in my day, a good GPU didn't cost over $1,000, and they came with mail-in rebates and vouchers for current AAA games. Now, components are nutso-butso prices, and they're trying to entice me with a free month of Discord Nitro? Get out of here. Where was I? Right, keys in the player's build. In the majority of RPGs, there are many keys to match each lock, but it's either highly unlikely or mathematically impossible that any given character will have all of the keys. If you don't have high enough speechcraft, you can't smooth talk your way into information, but your high mercantile skill means you have enough gold to refresh his memory, or perhaps your strength allows you to intimidate the informant, or you're great at stealth so you just steal what you're after. These are all different keys for the same lock. If you don't have access to one, a well-designed game will ensure you have access to another, even if it's just a default combat path or whatever. Bethesda could do better at surfacing this. Disappointingly few quests, even in their most recent titles Fallout 4 and Starfield, actually support multiple solutions, but they do exist and they do work. It's just underutilized. Combat also functions like a microcosm of this. For a melee character, your primary defensive option is your block skill. For mages, it's defensive wards. And for marksmen, it's just being real heckin' far away. These are all keys for the damage mitigation lock. And the same applies to dealing damage. Fighters hit, mages spell, and archers shoot. I really like this system. When well implemented, it doesn't feel frustrating, but advertises the game's replay value by hinting at the possibilities that could be enabled by different build choices the player can make on subsequent playthroughs. But not all things are unlocked through player-driven build decisions. Some are instead unlocked by way of progress through the game, which is not without its own trials and tribulations, though they're mostly down to issues of pacing. In linear games, pacing is simple enough for developers to control. The player is restricted to only the options that the developer has decided are available to them at any given time. In Halo, for example, you can't just turn around and go do something else. There's only one way to go, and it's forward, exactly as the developers intended. For open world games, there are things you can do when you turn around and walk away, which gives a great deal of freedom to the player, but presents some challenges that have to be kept in mind and controlled for during development. A common trick that many developers have used through the years is to have specific gateway steps within the main quest which funnel the player into separate linear sections, which allow pacing to be more controlled while new mechanics are introduced. There's a ton of games that do this, but the one that most readily comes to mind, for whatever reason, is Halo Infinite, which has discrete landmasses that you gradually unlock through the course of the game by completing short linear sections that connect them. This is also Zelda's whole thing. Completing a linear dungeon gives you a new toy, a key, and then you do nothing but use that toy on every single lock you see for the next few hours of the game. Skyrim itself even does this. There are probably better examples, but the one I'm thinking of is in the tunnels under Riften to get into the Thieves Guild. After you get to the end of the dungeon, you can lower a bridge so you never have to do that again. It's a small lock and key, but it's there. However, if the key is earned through progress in the game, and it is not progress within the very quest where the lock is presented to the player, then the time between the lock being presented and the key being given is entirely out of the designer's hands. You know what? Show a comments. Which one do you think Dragonrend is? I'm pausing for dramatic effect, but like, I can't see your comments before I post the video. What even is this joke I'm making? Have I finally lost it? Oh, how exciting. That'll be a novel experience. For those who don't know it by name alone, I'm sure there are a few of you interesting souls out there still watching this, Dragonrend is a dragon shout which forces dragons to land, stunning them for a time and thus leaving them vulnerable to attack. This is especially helpful for melee dominant characters, who otherwise have extremely limited windows during which they're able to deal damage to dragons. Anyway, Dragonrend is locked behind progress. You have to do the cutscene at the top of the Throne of the World to unlock it, which, if you haven't played through the main quest in a while, is not especially soon after dragons start to spawn. Dragons begin to spawn during the quest Dragon Rising, and Dragonrend becomes available during Alduin's Bane. That's a pretty sizable gap. Skyrim's main quest is... You know, I went to how long to beat for this because I don't honestly know what running straight through the main quest line works out to in terms of hour count, and this is all over the place. I don't use this site much because I just play games and don't really bother with the hour count as a marker of value, generally speaking, but These are four pretty drastically different times for games that are ostensibly more or less identical in terms of content. Anyway, let's call it something like 30 hours to beat Skyrim, if you ignore all of the best parts of the game. Assuming normal casual play, you can get to Dragon Rising within a couple hours, and there's only a couple more hours of main quest after getting Dragonrend, meaning that you'll be facing dragons without Dragonrend for 80% of the game? 80% if you just run through the main quest instead of playing Skyrim in a normal and enjoyable way by getting distracted somewhere in the middle for many hundreds of hours. So why do I care about Dragonrend so much? Mages and archers only have to aim a little higher to engage a dragon, but a melee character without Dragonrend has only two options, and they both kinda suck. We can switch to spells or archery that are almost definitely underleveled because those skills don't line up with the playstyle we're going for with this character, or we can just wait for it to land for brief periods. I shouldn't have to tell you that these both feel a little like failure. It's a lock and we don't have the matching key. Once you have Dragonrend, it completely changes the melee game against dragons. No longer are you waiting for them to give you a chance to deal damage, you're forcing them to fight on your terms. And I can't think of anything more warrior-coded than that. In fact, it evokes the trailer that sold Skyrim to the masses. By locking such an important part of the melee warrior's toolkit behind a substantial amount of progression, it pushes melee characters out of their core skills, forcing players to dip into spells or archery to make up for the gap in their offensive capabilities. You may remember that I said at the start, obviously, your melee character has to dip into their limited pools of magic or archery to fill the gap in their arsenal that is range. Historical knights were still skilled with a bow, and we still train today's troops, in some comparatively limited capacity, in melee combat. That's how it works. So, forcing the sword and board warrior to switch to bow is perfectly reasonable and even realistic. And yeah, but what isn't realistic is the way the world is not quite like reality. Game balance is a tricky thing to nail down, as you need to accommodate both your most adept players and your most inept. I've never noticed those words are so similar before. Hey Editor Tack, tell us if they're related. Thanks, Editor Tack. Us gamers, we're really weird. We try to break everything we find in hopefully useful ways. So rather than what normal people do in real life, where we get a little bit of skill in a lot of different things, we instead get really skilled at one thing. Our characters are the best, most lethal murdering machine to ever grace all of Tamriel, but they probably don't know how to mend clothes. Unless you install a mod for that, I guess. I'm just assuming there is one really, but I feel like that's probably a thing. So when designing the game, developers have to balance the game with the idea that the players could very well have a spiky profile, so encounters must challenge these min-maxed character builds. And because developers have to design their games with us weird min-maxers in mind, players must respond by, well, min-maxing, which reduces the entire build system into basically an arms race where spending skill points too far outside of the developer's expectations can leave you underpowered and left behind, with no especially good way to make it up later. This is what happened with Oblivion's legendarily scuffed leveling system. It's much reined in Skyrim, and for the better. Good job, Bethesda. But the balance is still tight enough that a weakness like the inability to deal damage to dragons for the majority of combat with them can turn players off a playstyle entirely. And that's just a damn shame, because it is pretty fun to bonk people sometimes. I want to thank you for being here and listening to my weird self-ramble about this ancient game we love. Like and subscribe if you want to, you know how the YouTube game works. There's also a link to my Discord in the description if you want to join that. I've been sharing stuff in there like sales that I happen upon and gaming news. Like, did you hear that Activision's user researchers voted to unionize? Or how Super Nintendos are getting faster over time? There's stuff like that in there. But at the end of the day, thank you very much for stopping by and lending me your ear. And, as always, have a great one.